My mom used to be my best friend, until she forced me to stop eating. It all started when puberty hit and I gained 3 pounds in 2 weeks. That night, she threw out all my favorite foods and set out rules for me. If I wanted lunch, I had to run a 5-minute sprint first. Earn your meals, she'd say, stopwatch in hand while I ran laps around our backyard, my empty stomach cramping with each step. The thing was, Dad worked late shifts and never saw it. And by the time he got home, Mom would have a normal-looking plate ready for me. From a distance, you couldn't tell the chicken was just garnish. The rice was just 3 grains spread out. Then came the Wednesday that changed everything. I'd bought a granola bar at school with birthday money from my grandmother. When Mom found the wrapper in my backpack, her face went cold. She marched me to the bathroom, stood behind me, and waited. That food wasn't approved by me, she said, her voice eerily calm. You know what to do. I was 14 years old, kneeling on our bathroom floor, while my mother watched to make sure I threw up every bite. You need to stay exactly as you are, she whispered. Trust me. Her voice had a desperation I didn't understand at the time. She banned me from eating at friends' houses after that, called the school cafeteria too, told them I had a medical condition, and couldn't purchase food. By winter, I was running on nothing. My hair fell out in clumps. And when my period stopped for 6 whole months, I knew something had to change. I had spent years in defense. It was time to switch to offense. I studied nutrition labels, calorie density, mass gainer supplements. The day I took over family meal prep, Mom actually smiled. My responsible daughter, she cooed to her friends. So mature, cooking for the family. Dad seemed pleased too, his hand lingering on my shoulder a beat too long. Mom's new special morning smoothie was my masterpiece. Vanilla protein powder masked the mass gainer. Banana covered the weight gain shake. I added a little honey to hide the 3,000-calorie bomb I handed her every morning at 6:55 a.m., the same time she used to weigh me. Just trying a new diet, I told Dad when he asked about Mom's smoothies. She said she wants to be healthier. The first week, she complained about feeling bloated. That's normal when you're getting healthy, I said sweetly, the same words she'd used when I complained of hunger pains. By week 2, her work pants were tight. I watched her pull at the waistband, confused. Then came the dinner performances. I'd serve Dad and my sister Kashmira full plates while Mom sat with her second smoothie of the day. She already ate, I'd tell Dad, my voice innocent. She had a big lunch at work, right, Mom? Mom would nod. The thing about mass gainers is that they have 3,000 calories of pure weight gain, but you're hungry again in an hour. She was so obsessed with her mysterious weight gain that she didn't even notice me eating full meals for the first time in years. I watched Mom's confusion turn to panic as the scale climbed. I don't understand, she whispered one night, standing in front of the mirror in clothes that no longer fit. I'm barely eating anything. Maybe you're just big-boned, I suggested, echoing what she'd told me when I'd begged for food. Some people are meant to be larger. Her friends started noticing. The gym mothers whispered when she walked by. Dad mentioned her weight gain at dinner, genuinely concerned. You used to be so tiny, he said, and something in his voice made my skin crawl. Maybe you should see a doctor, he continued. I'm fine, Mom snapped, her voice high and desperate. She looked at me across the table and I saw it, that flicker of understanding. 2 months in, she broke. I found her crying in the kitchen at 2 a.m., staring at the refrigerator. I'm so hungry, she sobbed when she saw me. I'm so hungry all the time, but I keep getting bigger. I don't understand what's happening to me. I leaned against the doorframe, feeling the ghost of my 14-year-old self, dizzy with starvation. Maybe you're being dramatic, I said, my voice steady. You know, some people just can't control themselves around food. Her face crumpled. In that moment, she finally knew. How does it feel? I asked quietly. When someone else controls your body, Mom. The silence stretched between us like a year of empty plates. Tears filled her eyes. You still don't get it, she asked. Get what? Your dad, she started. He isn't the man you think he is. She grabbed my shaking hands. I was just trying to protect you. I never meant to hurt you. Mom, what? If you never developed, he'd lose interest. No curves, no period, nothing to attract him. She wiped her tears. It worked, didn't it? He never hurt you in the way that he hurt me. She smiled like she was proud of herself. My eyes went wide, and suddenly I heard Dad walking down the steps. Dad's footsteps hit the kitchen floor and I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stand there watching Mom transform. She wiped her face fast and turned toward him with this smile that looked almost real if you didn't see the panic behind her eyes. Dad looked between us, and his expression shifted into something calculating, like he was trying to figure out what he'd interrupted. Mom's voice came out steady when she told him she'd been watching a sad movie on her phone and got emotional. Wasn't that silly of her? Dad walked over and put his hand on her shoulder, and I watched her whole body go tight for just a second, before she forced herself to relax under his touch. He told her she'd been crying a lot lately. Maybe she should talk to someone about her emotions, and his tone sounded concerned, but his eyes stayed cold and watchful. I mumbled something about going back to bed and moved toward the stairs on legs that felt like they might give out. Dad called after me asking if I was feeling okay, and I said yeah, just tired, and kept walking. I made it to my room and closed the door and sat on my bed in the dark, replaying everything Mom had said about protection and hurt, and Dad not being who I thought he was. Sleep didn't come for hours, and when it finally did, I dreamed about running laps in the backyard with an empty stomach, while Dad watched from the window. The next morning, I came downstairs and found Dad already at the kitchen table reading something on his tablet. Mom was at the stove making eggs, and Kashmira walked in wearing this huge oversized hoodie, even though the kitchen was warm from cooking. I watched Dad's eyes follow Kashmira as she reached up to grab the cereal box from the top shelf, and his gaze lingered on her in a way that made my skin crawl. He made some joke about Kashmira hiding her figure in all those baggy clothes, and asked when she was going to start dressing like a normal teenager. Mom's hand jerked and she almost dropped the spatula, her knuckles going white where she gripped the pan handle. Kashmira laughed it off with this forced lightness in her voice and said she just liked being comfortable. Then she poured her cereal really fast and left the kitchen. I suddenly remembered that 6 months ago, Kashmira used to wear normal fitted clothes, and somewhere along the way she'd switched to baggy layers and oversized hoodies. Dad went back to his tablet like nothing had happened, and Mom served him eggs with hands that shook slightly. I waited until I heard Dad's car pull out of the driveway before I went looking for Kashmira. I found her in the hallway outside her room and asked her directly if Dad had ever made her feel uncomfortable or weird. She looked away from me and said he was just being a dad. That's how dads are. But her voice had that same forced casual tone Mom uses when she's lying about something. I pressed her and asked why she started locking her bedroom door at night, something I'd noticed but never really thought about until now. Kashmira's face went red and she said she just wanted privacy, that she was getting older and needed space. But she wouldn't look at me when she said it. I told her she could talk to me about anything, and she nodded and said she knew that. Then she went into her room and closed the door, and I heard the lock click. At the school, I sat in the counseling office waiting area for 20 minutes trying to figure out how to explain what was happening without sounding completely insane. The secretary kept glancing at me like she was worried I might bolt, and I probably looked like I was about to. Lorraine Morgan finally opened her door and called me in, and I walked into her office on autopilot. She asked what was going on, and I just blurted out that my mom had been controlling my food for years to keep me from developing. The words came out in this rush, and once I started, I couldn't stop. Telling her about the forced vomiting and the meal restrictions, and Mom standing there with her stopwatch timing my sprints before she'd let me eat lunch. Lorraine's expression shifted from concerned to alarmed, and she started taking notes while I talked. I explained about my hair falling out and my period stopping for 6 months, and how Mom watched me to make sure I threw up the granola bar when I was 14. Lorraine asked me why my mom would do something like that, and I hesitated because saying it out loud would make it real, and there'd be no taking it back. I told her what Mom said in the kitchen about Dad and protection, about keeping me from developing so he'd lose interest. Lorraine's pen stopped moving, and she looked at me with this intensity that made my stomach drop to the floor. She explained really carefully that she was a mandated reporter, and what I just described required her to contact Child Protective Services. I felt the blood drain from my face because I hadn't thought that far ahead, hadn't realized that telling someone would trigger this whole process I couldn't control. I started panicking and tried to take it back, saying maybe I misunderstood what Mom meant, or maybe she was just being dramatic. Lorraine's voice stayed gentle but firm when she explained that food restriction to prevent development was abuse no matter what the reason behind it was. She promised to help me through whatever came next and asked if I felt safe going home today. I opened my mouth to answer and realized I didn't know what the honest answer was anymore. Was I safe from Mom now that she'd confessed? Was I safe from Dad now that I knew what Mom had been protecting me from? I told Lorraine I didn't know, and she nodded like that was the answer she'd expected. Lorraine picked up her phone and called CPS while I sat there in her office feeling like I was watching my life explode from outside my body. I heard her use words like failure to thrive and forced purging and potential sexual abuse risk. My hands started shaking so hard I had to sit on them, and I realized I'd just blown up my entire family with one conversation in a school counselor's office. Lorraine hung up and told me a caseworker named Harrison Riley would visit our home within 48 hours. She asked if I had somewhere else I could stay if I needed to, and I mentioned my grandmother who lived across town. Lorraine wrote down grandmother's number and told me to call her if anything felt wrong or unsafe before Harrison could get there. I went home that afternoon and the house was quiet except for sounds coming from upstairs. I found Mom in the bathroom standing on the scale with her face all crumpled up looking at the number. She'd gained another 4 pounds from the mass gainer smoothies, and when she tried to zip her work pants, they wouldn't close anymore. I stood in the doorway watching her struggle with the zipper and felt this flash of guilt seeing how upset she was. Then I remembered being 14 years old on the bathroom floor while she stood behind me making sure I threw up every bite of that granola bar, and the guilt just evaporated. Mom looked up and saw me watching, and her face went red with shame before she stepped off the scale and pushed past me out of the bathroom. That night, I lay in bed listening to Mom and Dad arguing in their bedroom through the wall. Dad's voice had this edge of disgust in it that made my skin crawl worse than anything else that had happened. I heard him say he married a thin woman and he didn't understand why she was letting herself go like this. Mom's voice came back small and apologetic, saying she didn't know what was wrong, that she was barely eating anything but kept gaining weight. Dad said something I couldn't hear, and then Mom apologized again in this tiny voice. I realized she'd been performing for him the same way she made me perform, shrinking herself down to whatever size and shape he wanted. I pulled my blanket up over my head, but I could still hear them through the wall, Mom apologizing, and Dad's voice getting colder. The next morning, I woke up with my phone already in my hand and started going through every text message Mom had ever sent me about food. I took screenshots of the ones where she listed exact calorie counts I was allowed each day, and the ones where she reminded me about weigh-in times. I found messages from 2 years ago where she told me I couldn't eat dinner because I'd had an apple at lunch without permission. Each screenshot went into a new folder on my phone labeled evidence, and I felt weird about building a case against my own mother, but I kept doing it anyway. I went downstairs to the garage and found the stopwatch she used to time my sprints before letting me eat lunch. It was sitting on a shelf next to Dad's tools, and I took a picture of it with my phone. Back in my room, I wrote down everything I could remember about the forced vomiting and the meal restrictions in my notes app. I documented the dates I could recall and the specific foods she'd thrown away. Looking at everything together made me feel sick, but also kind of relieved that I had proof of what happened. I heard Mom moving around in the kitchen and knew she was probably making her morning smoothie without realizing what was really in it. My phone buzzed with a call from a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, a man's voice said his name was Harrison Riley from CPS. He asked if he could schedule a home visit for tomorrow afternoon, and I said yes, even though my stomach dropped. After I hung up, I heard Mom's footsteps racing up the stairs, and she burst into my room asking who called. I told her it was the social worker and watched her face go white. She ran back downstairs, and I followed her to find her pulling every box of cereal and can of soup from the back of the pantry where she'd been hiding them. She filled the kitchen shelves with normal food and shoved granola bars into the cabinet and put fresh fruit in a bowl on the counter. I watched her create this whole performance of a regular kitchen and realized she'd been doing the same thing for years whenever Dad came home late. She'd stage a normal-looking dinner plate for me right before he walked in so he'd never see how little I actually ate. She grabbed her scale from the bathroom and carried it out to the garage to hide it behind some boxes. Her hands were shaking the whole time, and she kept muttering about how everything needed to look right. I found Kashmira in her room doing homework and sat down on her bed. I told her a social worker was coming tomorrow to talk to us about family stuff, and she immediately closed her textbook. She asked if I reported something, and her eyes got really wide. I explained that I talked to my counselor about Mom's food rules, and it went further than I expected, but I was worried about both of us being safe. Kashmira got defensive and said Mom was just trying to help me be healthy, and why would I get CPS involved? I told her it was more complicated than that, and there were things about Dad that made me worried for her too. She got quiet and picked at her bedspread, and then admitted that sometimes Dad stands outside her door at night. She said she can see his shadow under the crack at the bottom, and it stays there for a while before he walks away. Her voice shook when she said it was probably nothing, and he was probably just checking on her. I felt rage building up in my chest that she was already making excuses for his creepy behavior. I told her that wasn't normal, and dads don't stand outside their daughters' doors at night for no reason. She started crying and said she didn't want to think about it and couldn't I just leave it alone. The next afternoon, Harrison Riley showed up right on time, and he was younger than I expected, maybe late 20s with dark circles under his eyes. Mom had put on makeup and a nice shirt, and she smiled when she opened the door. She offered him coffee and led him to the living room where Dad was sitting in his recliner looking concerned. Harrison had a briefcase and a notepad, and he asked if he could speak with me and Kashmira separately. I saw panic flash across Mom's face, but she nodded and tried to keep smiling. Harrison followed me upstairs to my room and sat in my desk chair while I sat on my bed. He asked basic questions about what I ate in a typical day and how meals worked in our family. I could tell he was trying to figure out if Mom had coached me on what to say. I told him the truth about the food restrictions starting when I was 14 and the forced vomiting after the granola bar incident. His face stayed neutral, but he wrote everything down in his notepad. He asked if I'd ever felt unsafe in other ways besides the food control, and I hesitated. I didn't know how to explain the complicated truth about Dad's comments on my body and Mom's twisted way of protecting me. I ended up telling him about Dad's attention shifting to Kashmira and the shadow under her door at night. Harrison wrote that down too and asked a few more questions about Dad's behavior. After he finished with me, he interviewed Kashmira in her room, and I waited downstairs in the kitchen. I could hear Mom and Dad talking in low voices in the living room. When Harrison came back down, he asked to speak with both my parents together, and I went to sit on the stairs where I could hear them. Dad's voice got louder pretty quickly, and he demanded to know who made these crazy accusations about him. Mom's voice was quiet and defensive, and she said she was just trying to teach me healthy habits. Harrison stayed calm and professional, and explained that the investigation would continue no matter what they said. I heard papers rustling and Harrison's measured tone describing the next steps in the process. That night after Harrison left, I heard Dad confront Mom in their bedroom. His voice was low and angry, and he wanted to know what she told me to make me report them to CPS. Mom was crying and saying she never told me anything, and I must have misunderstood her concerns about nutrition. Dad's voice dropped to a whisper, and I couldn't hear the actual words anymore, but the tone made my blood run cold. I lay in bed with my phone in my hand, ready to call Lorraine if things got worse. The next morning, Mom cornered me in the kitchen before school. Her eyes were red and desperate, and she grabbed both my hands. She begged me to tell Harrison that I exaggerated everything and said Dad was furious. She said if CPS kept investigating, it would destroy our family and everything would fall apart. I pulled my hands away and told her the family was already destroyed when she started starving me at 14. She started crying harder, but I grabbed my backpack and left for school. At the school, Lorraine pulled me aside during second period and asked how I was doing. I broke down crying right there in the hallway and told her about the home visit and Mom's begging and Dad's anger the night before. Lorraine brought me to her office and closed the door. She explained that the investigation process was hard but necessary and that Harrison was good at his job. She asked if I had somewhere safe to stay if things got worse at home, and I mentioned my grandmother who lived across town. Lorraine wrote down my grandmother's phone number and told me to call her anytime if I needed to leave the house quickly. Lorraine pulls out her phone and opens a new contact entry, typing in her cell number before handing it to me. She explains that if I ever feel unsafe, I should text her a specific code word, something that sounds normal but signals danger. We decide on smoothie recipe since it relates to my situation, but wouldn't seem weird if someone saw the message. She programs her number under a casual name in my contacts, so it doesn't look suspicious if Dad checks my phone. I save it, and she makes me promise to use it if I need to, no matter what time it is. The whole thing makes me feel protected and scared at the same time, like having a fire escape plan means admitting the house might actually burn down. Lorraine walks me to my next class and I spend the rest of the day distracted, checking my phone every few minutes to make sure the number is still there. A week passes and Harrison calls while I'm doing homework after school. His voice is calm but serious as he asks if I can come to the CPS office tomorrow for a follow-up meeting. He says he needs more detailed information about some things from the home visit. I agree and hang up, then tell Mom about the appointment. Her face goes pale and she nods without saying anything. The next afternoon, she drives me to the CPS office and the silence in the car is so thick I can barely breathe. I watch her hands shake on the steering wheel at every stoplight. In the waiting room, she leans close and whispers that I need to be careful what I say because Dad has been talking to lawyers. Her breath smells like coffee and fear. I pull away and stare at the motivational posters on the wall until Harrison calls my name. In his office, I sit in a plastic chair across from his desk, and he opens a folder with my name on it. He asks me to walk him through exactly what Mom said in the kitchen that night. I tell him everything. The words about Dad and protection and keeping me from developing so he'd lose interest. Harrison's face gets darker as I talk, and his pen stops moving across the notepad. He asks directly if Dad has ever touched me in ways that made me uncomfortable, or said things about my body that seemed wrong. I explain about the comments when I started gaining weight back, and how his attention shifted to Kashmira once she hit puberty. I describe the way he looks at her now and the shadow under her door at night. Harrison picks up his phone before I finish talking. He dials a number and I hear him use words like concerning patterns and possible grooming behavior to whoever answers. When he hangs up, he explains that what I've described requires law enforcement involvement, and he's contacted a detective who handles these specific cases. My stomach drops and I feel panic climbing up my throat because this is bigger than I imagined when I first talked to Lorraine. Harrison leans forward and tells me I did the right thing by speaking up. His tone is serious and professional, not reassuring, and I realize he thinks the situation is worse than even I understood. He says the detective will want to interview me separately, and that Mom and Dad will be informed about the police involvement. I nod, but my hands are shaking in my lap. That evening, my phone rings with a number I don't recognize. A woman introduces herself as Detective Cynthia Booth and asks if I can come to the police station tomorrow after school. Her voice is kind but has that professional edge that makes it clear this isn't optional. She explains that she needs to take a formal statement about the concerns Harrison raised with her office. I say yes, and she gives me the address and tells me to bring a parent or trusted adult. After I hang up, I sit on my bed at grandmother's house feeling like I've started something rolling downhill that I can't stop anymore. The whole system is moving now, and I'm just trying not to get crushed by it. That night, I go back home for dinner because Mom insisted and Dad is extra friendly in a way that makes my skin crawl. He asks about my day and what I learned in the school, smiling too much. He compliments the chicken Mom made and thanks her for taking such good care of the family. I watch Kashmira across the table and see her shrink into her hoodie when Dad reaches over to ruffle her hair. She doesn't smile back at him. Mom barely touches her food and keeps glancing at me with desperate eyes. I realize she's scared of what I might have told Harrison, and even more scared of what I might tell the police. The whole dinner feels like a performance, and I'm the only one who can see through it. The next day after school, grandmother drives me to the police station. Detective Booth meets us in the lobby and takes us to a small room with comfortable chairs and a box of tissues on the corner table. She asks me to start from the beginning and tell her everything. I talk for over an hour about the food restriction, and the forced vomiting, and the weigh-ins, and the sprints before lunch. I tell her about Mom's confession in the kitchen and what she said about Dad and protection. Detective Booth takes notes the whole time and occasionally asks me to clarify details or give specific examples. Her expression gets more concerned as I describe years of surveillance and control. She asks about Kashmira, and I tell her about the shadow under the door, and Dad's comments and the way my sister dresses now. Detective Booth writes it all down. When I finish, she explains that they'll need to interview Kashmira separately, using a forensic interviewer who's specially trained to talk to kids about these situations. She says the process might be uncomfortable, but it's necessary to understand what's really happening in our home. I feel guilty for dragging Kashmira into this because she didn't ask to be part of the investigation. Detective Booth must see it on my face because she tells me that protecting my sister is the right thing to do, and that Kashmira deserves the same safety I'm trying to create. She gives me her card and says to call if I remember anything else, or if the situation at home gets worse. Grandmother squeezes my hand as we leave. When we get back to the house, Mom is waiting in the kitchen. She asks immediately what I told the detective, and her voice is high and tight. I tell her the truth, that I explained everything about the food control and what she said about Dad. Her face crumples and she grabs the counter like she might fall. She says I've ruined everything and that Dad will never forgive either of us now. Her anger mixes with fear, and I realize she's more scared of Dad's reaction than any legal trouble. She keeps saying I don't understand what I've done and that the family is destroyed. I grab my backpack and go upstairs to my room, leaving her crying in the kitchen. Late that night, I hear them arguing in their bedroom. Dad's voice cuts through the wall, sharp and accusing. I press my ear to the door and catch fragments about what Mom told me and why I would make up stories about him. Mom's voice is small and defensive, insisting she never said anything inappropriate, but she sounds like she's lying even to herself. Dad demands to know exactly what she said in the kitchen that night. I hear something crash, maybe a lamp or a picture frame, and then sudden silence. I lie in bed with my phone in my hand, Lorraine's number pulled up and ready to call, listening to the quiet and wondering if the silence is worse than the yelling. The next morning, I wake up to the sound of Mom's voice in the hallway telling Kashmira to get ready because they have to leave in an hour. I stay in bed listening to my sister's footsteps move slowly to the bathroom and the water running for a long time like she's trying to delay what's coming. When I finally go downstairs, Mom is standing by the front door with her purse and keys, wearing pants that don't quite fit right anymore, and a sweater that pulls tight across her middle. Kashmira comes down in an oversized hoodie and sweatpants, her face pale and her eyes red like she's been crying. Mom tells me they'll be back in a few hours and her voice sounds hollow and tired. I watch them get in the car through the living room window, and Kashmira stares straight ahead without moving while Mom backs out of the driveway. The house feels too quiet after they leave, and I sit on the couch trying not to think about what questions they're asking my sister right now. 3 hours later, I hear the car pull up and I go to the door. Kashmira walks past me without making eye contact and goes straight upstairs to her room, closing the door hard enough that the frame shakes. Mom comes in behind her and sinks onto the couch like her legs won't hold her up anymore. I ask how it went and Mom just shakes her head, her hands trembling in her lap. I try asking Kashmira later when I knock on her door, but she tells me through the wood that she doesn't want to talk about it. Mom has aged in a way that seems impossible for just 2 weeks, her face drawn and her new weight sitting on her body in a way that looks uncomfortable and wrong. That night my phone rings and it's Harrison calling to give me an update. He tells me Kashmira's interview showed some concerning patterns, but she wasn't ready to fully talk about everything yet. His voice is careful and professional when he explains that this happens a lot with kids who still live in the house with the person they're scared of. He asks if I would be willing to stay with my grandmother for a while to give Kashmira more space to feel safe, and I say yes before he even finishes the question. He thanks me and says he'll call Mom tomorrow to arrange everything. I hang up and stare at my bedroom ceiling thinking about how Kashmira must feel, knowing that everyone is waiting for her to say more than she's ready to say. The next afternoon, I pack a bag with clothes and my phone charger and some books, moving through my room like I'm on autopilot. Mom appears in my doorway and tells me it's time to go, her voice flat and empty. We get in the car and she doesn't turn on the radio or say anything for the entire 20-minute drive across town. I watch the houses go by and try not to feel guilty about leaving Kashmira behind, even though I know it's supposed to help her. When we pull up to grandmother's house, she's already standing on the porch like she knew we were coming. Mom parks and grandmother walks down the steps, her eyes moving between my face and Mom's like she's reading a situation she doesn't fully understand yet. Mom gets my bag from the trunk and hands it to me without meeting my eyes, then gets back in the car. Grandmother watches Mom drive away before putting her arm around my shoulders and guiding me inside. She sits me down at her kitchen table and makes tea in the blue kettle she's had forever, the one that whistles when the water boils. She sets a cup in front of me and asks very gently why I'm suddenly staying with her. I tell her a version of the truth about Mom's food rules and the weigh-ins and the forced vomiting, leaving out the parts about Dad and what Mom said in the kitchen that night. Grandmother's face goes white and her hand shakes when she sets down her own teacup. She tells me she noticed I was getting too thin over the past few years, but Mom always had explanations about my fast metabolism or my picky eating habits. She apologizes for not seeing what was really happening and her voice cracks on the last word. I realize sitting there that the whole family probably saw signs, but everyone just accepted Mom's excuses because it was easier than asking hard questions. Grandmother reaches across the table and squeezes my hand, telling me I can stay as long as I need to. She's going to make sure I'm safe now. That first night at her house, I sleep in the guest room with the window open and the sound of crickets coming through the screen. I don't lie awake listening for footsteps in the hallway, or Dad's shadow under my door. Grandmother doesn't mention my body or my weight when I come down for breakfast the next morning, just asks what I want to eat like it's the most normal question in the world. I eat scrambled eggs and toast, and she doesn't watch me or count anything or make comments. The tension I've been carrying in my shoulders for years starts to ease just a tiny bit. Over the next few days, I settle into a routine of eating regular meals and sleeping without fear, and it feels like I can finally breathe properly. Then Detective Booth calls my cell phone one afternoon while I'm sitting on grandmother's back porch. She tells me they're building a case, but it's more complicated than she hoped, because most of the evidence is based on statements instead of physical proof. Mom's admission about the food control is documented in the CPS reports, but proving Dad's intentions is harder without clear incidents of actual abuse. Her voice is frustrated when she explains this, and I feel my own frustration rising, because it seems like the system is set up to wait for something worse to happen before they can really protect us. She promises they're still investigating and asks me to call if I remember any other details. I hang up feeling defeated and angry at the same time. A week later, Harrison calls to tell me he's scheduled a family meeting at the CPS office and both my parents have to attend. He asks if I want grandmother to come with me as a support person, and I say yes immediately because I can't imagine facing mom and dad alone in that room. The day of the meeting, grandmother drives me downtown to the CPS building, and we sit in the waiting room until Harrison comes to get us. He leads us to a conference room where mom and dad are already sitting on opposite sides of the table. The tension in the room feels thick enough to choke on, and I take the seat next to grandmother as far from dad as I can get. Harrison sits at the head of the table with a folder of papers and starts explaining the findings from the investigation so far. He uses words like substantiated neglect and concerning patterns and safety measures, his voice calm and professional the whole time. He tells my parents that a safety plan needs to be put in place right away to protect me and Kashmira. Dad sits with his arms crossed over his chest and his jaw tight, and every few minutes he interrupts to say, "This is all a big misunderstanding that got blown way out of proportion." Mom sits crying silently with tissues wadded up in her hands, and I can see her torn between wanting to protect us and not wanting to lose her marriage. Harrison stays professional but firm, making it clear that the safety plan isn't optional no matter how much they cooperate or don't cooperate. He explains that the plan requires Dad to have no contact with me or Kashmira unless someone else is supervising, and this will stay in effect until the investigation is finished. Dad's face turns red and he starts arguing about his rights as a parent, his voice getting louder with each word. Harrison waits for him to finish and then calmly explains that these are temporary measures to keep us safe, and refusing to follow them will lead to more serious interventions like removal from the home. The meeting lasts almost 2 hours, and by the end I feel exhausted and shaky. Grandmother drives me back to her house and makes me sit on the couch while she brings me water and a snack. She tells me I'm welcome to stay with her for as long as I need to, that her house is my house now. Then she admits something that makes my chest feel tight. She says she never liked the way Dad looked at me during family gatherings over the years, but she dismissed her gut feeling as just being an overprotective grandmother. I feel validated hearing this because it means I wasn't imagining the wrongness, that someone else noticed it too, even if they didn't act on it at the time. Next week, I meet with Arjun at his office and he spreads papers across his desk, organizing everything into categories that make sense for court. He pulls up my text messages with Mom on his computer screen and highlights the ones where she details my exact meal portions and weigh-in times. Then he adds my written statements to Detective Booth about the forced vomiting and the bathroom surveillance. Harrison sent over his case notes with official letterhead, and Arjun staples those to a separate document. I show him the folder on my phone where I saved screenshots of Dad's comments over the years, the ones about my body that made my skin crawl. Arjun prints each one and arranges them in order by date. Looking at everything together on his desk makes the pattern impossible to ignore, even though each piece by itself seems small. Arjun explains that judges look for patterns of behavior, not just single big incidents. He says what Mom did with the food control combined with what she admitted about Dad creates a clear picture of danger in our home. We spend 3 hours going through every detail, and by the end my evidence file is 2 inches thick. Arjun says we have enough to file for a restraining order and asks if I'm ready to do this. I tell him yes because staying silent feels more dangerous than speaking up. 2 days later, we go to the courthouse and fill out forms at a counter where a clerk checks our paperwork. The clerk stamps everything and tells us the hearing is scheduled in exactly 2 weeks. Arjun explains that Dad will be served with the papers at his work tomorrow, and that Mom will probably call me upset. I feel my stomach drop thinking about that phone call, but Arjun reminds me that I'm doing this to protect myself and Kashmira. The next afternoon, I'm sitting in grandmother's living room when my phone rings and Mom's name appears on the screen. I answer and immediately hear her crying so hard she can barely speak. She tells me Dad was handed legal papers at his office in front of his coworkers, and he came home furious. She says I'm destroying the family and that Dad is talking about divorce now. Her voice gets higher and more desperate as she begs me to drop the restraining order. I take a breath and tell her that Dad destroyed the family years ago, when he started looking at me in ways fathers shouldn't look at daughters. I tell her she chose to enable him instead of protecting us, and that her twisted solution of starving me was abuse. Mom starts crying harder and says I don't understand the impossible position she was in. I tell her I understand perfectly, and that I'm done being her excuse for staying with a dangerous man. Then I hang up while she's still talking. My hands shake for 10 minutes after, but I know I said what needed to be said. Grandmother makes me tea and sits with me on the couch without asking questions. The night before the hearing, my phone rings again, and this time it's Kashmira calling from Mom's number. Her voice sounds small when she asks if I'm really going through with the court thing tomorrow. I tell her I'm doing it to protect both of us from Dad's behavior. There's a long silence on the line and I can hear her breathing. Finally, she admits that she's scared of Dad too, that the way he looks at her makes her uncomfortable. She says she doesn't want to testify because she still lives in the house with him. I tell her she doesn't have to testify and that I have enough evidence without her. She's quiet again and then says she hopes I win tomorrow. I can hear the conflict in her voice, like she's torn between wanting to be loyal to the family and wanting to be safe. After we hang up, I lie in bed staring at the ceiling and thinking about how Dad has trained all of us to protect him. The next morning, Arjun picks me up at 8 and we drive to the courthouse together. He's wearing a suit and carrying a briefcase full of our evidence. We sit in a waiting room with uncomfortable chairs until a clerk calls my name. The courtroom is smaller than I expected with wood paneling on the walls. Dad sits at a table with his lawyer, a woman in a gray suit who looks bored. Mom sits in the back row crying quietly into tissues. The judge is an older woman with glasses who tells everyone to sit down. Arjun presents our evidence first, laying out the pattern of Dad's inappropriate comments about my body over several years. He shows the judge the texts from Mom about the food control and reads Mom's own words about keeping me from developing to prevent Dad's interest. Dad's lawyer stands up and argues that I'm a troubled teenager who's exaggerating normal parental concern. She says Dad only wanted me to be healthy, and that teenage girls often misinterpret their father's attention. The judge looks skeptical and asks Dad's lawyer to explain why Mom would admit to starving me if it was just about health. Dad's lawyer stumbles through an answer about Mom having her own issues. Then the judge asks me to testify, and I walk to the witness stand with my heart pounding. I describe Dad's comments about my developing body and the way his hands would linger on my shoulders. I explain what Mom told me in the kitchen about protection and keeping me from attracting him. Dad's lawyer tries to interrupt, but the judge tells her to wait. Arjun shows the judge Harrison's professional assessment and Detective Booth's report. After 2 hours of testimony, the judge announces she's granting a temporary restraining order pending a full hearing in 60 days. She says the evidence shows a pattern of concerning behavior that warrants protective measures. Dad's face turns red and he starts to stand up, but his lawyer pulls him back down. The judge orders Dad to stay away from me completely and to have only supervised contact with Kashmira until the full hearing. She says Mom can remain in the home with Kashmira, but CPS will monitor the situation with regular check-ins from Harrison. I feel relief wash over me, but also guilt, because I just legally separated our family. Arjun squeezes my shoulder and tells me I did the right thing. Outside the courtroom, Grandmother hugs me tight and says she's proud of me for being brave. Over the next month, I see Ainsley twice a week, and we work through my complicated feelings about Mom. I tell Ainsley that I hate Mom for what she did, but I also feel sorry for her because Dad hurt her too. Ainsley explains that I can acknowledge Mom's trauma while still holding her accountable for abusing me. She says Mom being a victim doesn't excuse her from being an abuser. This framework helps me separate my anger at what Mom did from my pity for what Dad did to her. Some days I lean more toward anger, and other days I feel more sadness. Ainsley says both feelings can exist at the same time, and that's normal. Meanwhile, my body keeps recovering with help from the nutritionist who monitors my progress every 2 weeks. I gain back 12 pounds over 6 weeks, and my clothes start fitting differently. The nutritionist explains that my body is healing from years of starvation, and that weight gain is necessary for recovery. My period comes back one morning after being gone for over a year, and I cry in the bathroom because it feels like reclaiming something Mom stole from me. The physical changes are uncomfortable, and sometimes I catch myself wanting to restrict food again out of habit. But then I remember that eating normally is taking back control of my own body. I'm learning to eat when I'm hungry and stop when I'm full without calculating whether I earned the meal. Some days are harder than others, and I still feel guilty reaching for snacks between meals. The nutritionist reminds me that my body needs fuel to heal, and that food isn't something I have to earn. Kashmira starts spending weekends at Grandmother's house with me, and slowly she opens up about Dad. The first weekend she barely talks and spends most of the time in the guest room. But by the third weekend, she sits with me in the kitchen and describes how Dad comments on her body when Mom isn't around. She tells me about the way he hugs her too tight and too long, his hands sliding lower than they should. I watch her face as she talks and see her starting to recognize that his behavior isn't normal father-daughter interaction. She's not ready to make formal statements to Harrison or Detective Booth yet, but she's beginning to acknowledge the problem. I don't push her because I remember how hard it was for me to speak up. 3 weeks after the temporary restraining order, Harrison calls to tell me he's closing the neglect case against Mom with a finding of substantiated abuse. He explains that the food restriction and forced vomiting are documented clearly enough to prove neglect. Mom has to complete parenting classes and continue therapy as conditions of keeping custody of Kashmira. Harrison says the case involving Dad remains open but inactive because there's not enough evidence yet for criminal charges. He tells me that if Kashmira decides to make statements, or if any new evidence comes up, they can reopen the investigation immediately. I feel frustrated that Dad might avoid consequences, but Harrison reminds me that the restraining order is still protecting us. A few days later, Detective Booth calls and I can hear the disappointment in her voice. She explains that without additional evidence or victim testimony, they won't be pursuing criminal charges against Dad right now. She emphasizes that the case stays open, and if anything new comes to light, they can restart the investigation. I tell her I understand, but inside I'm angry that the system seems to require waiting for something worse to happen before they can act. Detective Booth promises they're still watching and asks me to call if I remember any other details, or if Dad violates the restraining order. After we hang up, I sit on Grandmother's porch feeling defeated. Ainsley helps me process this frustration in our next session by reminding me that legal justice and personal safety are separate things. She says I've already accomplished the main goal, which is creating distance between Dad and us. The restraining order means he can't come near me, and Kashmira has more protection now than before. Ainsley explains that sometimes the system fails to deliver perfect justice, But that doesn't mean speaking up was wrong. I'm learning to accept that protecting myself and my sister matters more than seeing Dad punished, even though part of me still wants him to face consequences for what he's done. 60 days later, I sit in the courtroom for the full restraining order hearing and watch the judge review all the evidence Harrison and Detective Booth compiled over the past 2 months. Dad's lawyer stands up and argues that the temporary order was unnecessary, claiming I misinterpreted normal parental concern and that my statements were influenced by my troubled relationship with my mother. The lawyer talks about Dad's clean record and his role as a provider for the family, painting him as a concerned father caught in a messy family dispute. Arjun stands up to respond and presents the documented pattern of concerning behavior, Mom's statement about her protective intentions, and Harrison's professional assessment of the family dynamics. The judge listens to both sides and then asks Dad directly if he understands why his daughter felt unsafe. Dad gives some rehearsed answer about misunderstandings and wanting to rebuild trust, but his tone sounds more annoyed than apologetic. The judge looks at me and asks if I feel the restraining order is still necessary. I tell her yes and explain that I need legal protection to feel safe, that a pattern of behavior doesn't disappear just because someone says the right words in court. She nods and grants a 2-year restraining order, citing the documented concerns and the need to protect me while I finish high school and transition to adulthood. Dad's face goes red and his lawyer starts to object, but the judge cuts him off, saying the decision is final. I leave the courthouse with Arjun and grandmother, and for the first time in months, I feel like someone in authority actually listened and took my safety seriously. Back at grandmother's house, Arjun sits with me at the kitchen table and explains what the restraining order means in practical terms. He tells me to document any contact attempts from Dad, even indirect ones through other people or social media. He advises me to keep my phone charged and with me at all times, and to call the police immediately if Dad violates the order by showing up at the school or grandmother's house. I program the non-emergency police number into my phone and create a folder for screenshots in case I need evidence. Arjun reminds me that a restraining order is just paper and can't physically stop someone who's determined to violate it, so I need to stay aware of my surroundings. The next day in therapy, Ainsley tells me the hypervigilance I'm feeling is a normal trauma response. I explain how I keep checking the locks on grandmother's doors and looking out the window to make sure Dad's car isn't parked on the street. She teaches me some grounding techniques for when the anxiety gets overwhelming, and reminds me that taking precautions is smart, but I also need to live my life. 3 months after the restraining order hearing, Mom calls me from her cell phone and her voice sounds different, steadier somehow. She tells me she filed for separation from Dad and is looking for her own apartment. I ask her why now, and she says she finally understands she was enabling his behavior and that she needs to protect Kashmira even if it costs her marriage. She admits that living with Dad after the restraining order made her see how controlling he is, how he monitors everything she does and gets angry when she doesn't perform the way he expects. I want to believe her growth is real, but I'm cautious after years of watching her choose Dad over my safety. I tell her I hope she follows through this time, and that Kashmira deserves a mother who actually protects her. Mom cries on the phone and says she knows she failed me, but she's trying to do better now. We hang up and I sit on grandmother's porch feeling complicated things, angry at Mom for taking so long but also hoping she really has changed. Over the next few weeks, Mom discovers things during the separation process that shock her. She finds financial accounts Dad never told her about, credit cards in her name that she didn't open, and evidence that he's been monitoring her phone and email for years. She calls grandmother crying and admits she felt trapped in the marriage long before the CPS investigation started. Grandmother listens and then gently points out that my disclosure gave Mom an exit she couldn't create on her own, that sometimes the truth breaks things open in necessary ways. Mom admits this is true and says she's grateful I was brave enough to speak up even though it destroyed our family structure. I overhear parts of this conversation from the hallway and feel weird about being called brave when I mostly just wanted to stop feeling powerless. A month later, Mom tells me she started attending a support group for survivors of domestic abuse at the community center. She describes recognizing her own story and other women's experiences, understanding for the first time that Dad's control wasn't normal marriage stress, but actual abuse. She sends me a letter a few days later, 3 pages of handwritten apology for the food control and forced vomiting. She writes that she harmed me while trying to protect me in a twisted way, that she understands now how wrong her methods were regardless of her intentions. The apology feels incomplete because she focuses more on her own victimization than the specific damage she caused, but it's more accountability than I expected from her. I bring the letter to therapy, and Ainsley helps me figure out how much reconciliation I'm comfortable with. We decide on supervised visits once a month where Mom can prove through actions that she's actually changing, not just saying the right words. 6 months after moving in with grandmother, I go to the nutritionist for a checkup, and she tells me I'm physically healthier than I've been in years. My hair stopped falling out around month 3 and now it's growing back thicker. My weight settled at a number she says is appropriate for my height and age, and more importantly, my period came back regular after being gone for over a year. The nutritionist shows me charts tracking my progress and explains that my body is finally getting consistent nutrition without the restriction cycles. But the bigger change is mental, learning to recognize actual hunger cues instead of just eating when someone else decides I'm allowed. I still have hard days where I feel guilty reaching for snacks between meals, where Mom's voice in my head tells me I haven't earned the food. Grandmother notices when I'm struggling and gently reminds me that my body needs fuel, that eating isn't something I have to deserve. I'm working on believing her. When Mom's work schedule gets too unpredictable to supervise Kashmira properly, my sister moves in with Grandmother and me full-time. Having Kashmira in the same house changes things in good ways. I can model healthy eating and body image for her, showing her that food isn't punishment or reward, but just fuel. I watch her slowly unlearn some of the toxic messages we both received growing up. She sees me eat breakfast without running laps first, snack when I'm hungry without asking permission, and gradually she starts doing the same. She's still cautious and watches me sometimes like she's waiting for the other shoe to drop, but week by week she relaxes more. Kashmira starts her own therapy with a different counselor who specializes in younger teens, and she begins the long process of understanding what happened to us and why it wasn't normal or okay. One afternoon, Lorraine calls me into her office at the school and tells me she's proud of how I've handled everything. She says most kids in my situation would have given up or turned to destructive coping, but I kept fighting for myself and my sister. She pulls out college brochures and we start talking about applications, discussing options for staying local so I can maintain stability with Grandmother and Kashmira. She helps me research schools with good support services for students with trauma histories, and for the first time I'm thinking about a future beyond just surviving. I'm imagining what I want my life to look like, what I want to study, who I want to become. Lorraine suggests social work or counseling since I have first-hand experience with the system, but she also reminds me I don't have to turn my trauma into my career if I don't want to. As graduation approaches, I find myself thinking about how different my life is now compared to a year ago when I was starving and powerless. The legal system didn't give me perfect justice because Dad never faced criminal charges, and the restraining order is just temporary protection. My family is broken in ways that might never fully heal, with Mom and Dad separated and years of damage between all of us. But Kashmira and I are safe now, living with Grandmother and learning to trust again slowly. I still carry the trauma and probably always will, waking up sometimes from nightmares about being weighed or forced to vomit. But I also carry the knowledge that I was strong enough to break the silence when it mattered, that I created space for both of us to recover even when the adults around us failed to protect us first. The ending isn't neat or completely resolved like in movies, but it's real and it's ours. And sitting here on Grandmother's porch watching Kashmira do homework at the kitchen table through the window, that feels like enough for now. That's it for today's story. Thanks for spending part of your day here. It really means more than you think. I hope it left you feeling a little more hopeful. Subscribe if you want to keep that energy going.